Politics and Society in the Gilded Age, Part B. So remember, we said the Gilded Age is really this time at the end of the late 1800s, right after the Civil War, where things in American society are going pretty good, especially for the wealthiest. I mean, there were still a lot of poor people living in very bad conditions, especially in cities. And obviously, if you're a minority group or Native American, things weren't great at all. But generally, the standard of living for Americans was rising as America became an industrial giant. And by the time we get to the early 1900s, America is poised to be one of the big power countries on earth. It doesn't mean everything was great. We've talked about some of the labor issues. You've seen and thought about industry and some of the working conditions and life in the city as cities become bigger and more crowded and in many cases overcrowded with immigrants trying to make their way in America. It can be kind of dangerous as immigrant groups, say from Germany, may not want people from Italy or from Ireland. There's just a lot of tension in these big cities, which will lead to a lot of problems. But today, on this video, we want to talk more about what's happening in society and politics, and generally more about politics in this one. So in Part A, we covered food and the Jungle, the book that came out that exposed working conditions and the food conditions that people were eating and just general life in America for people of color and the people living in the cities, what they did for entertainment, all of that. But in this Part B, we want to talk more about the politics of life during the Gilded Age and the Industrial Age. So just real quick, looking at the top of American politics after the Civil War into the early 1900s, here's a list of our presidents, and you can see a couple things. One, the presidents with a pink star would be from Ohio, and you can see how important Ohio was in this time period. We have 5 presidents that are from Ohio. In fact, 3 back to back to back there from the late 1860s to early 1800s. You can also see that they are mostly Republicans. That's why the little elephant. The Republicans dominated, right? The Democrats tended to be on the wrong side of the Civil War. And so for many years, Republicans would dominate in the White House. There is Grover Cleveland, as you can see off this chart. He's the one Democrat who has some success. And kind of in a strange mix, he is the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. So he's president, the 22nd president. He loses to Benjamin Harrison, but then comes back 4 years later in a rematch and wins against Benjamin Harrison. So he's the only president so far to have 2 non-consecutive terms. And it's also kind of a violent period. We have presidents who are killed. Abraham Lincoln, he was killed, assassinated in 1865. James Garfield, who's president from Ohio, is assassinated only after a few months in office. He will die. And William McKinley, another Ohio president, will die as a result of being assassinated. And his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, would become one of our most popular presidents. But generally, as we look at these presidents in the second half of the 1800s, Republican dominating, as the Democrats tended to be more successful maybe on the local level in big cities, but Republicans were in charge. So let's think about some of the issues that were going on politically. Of course, since the very beginning of American history, the government's trying to figure out how to handle Native Americans. Both sides want the land. The natives were here first. America tended to be more powerful and was able to take it and continually pushes Native Americans off their land. Some of the most famous Indian battles, Native American battles that take place in the late 1800s. So perhaps you've heard of the Battle of Little Bighorn, George Custer, and Sitting Bull. This occurs in Montana, and Custer is defeated. So occasionally the Native Americans will win, but they just really don't stand a chance against America's might, the army, and just the sheer number of soldiers. Maybe you've heard of Geronimo. He was an Apache leader. He's not a chief, but he's this war leader that becomes rather famous in American history and will fight bravely but then be captured, but would be used by the government to kind of promote the government's policies on what's happening with Native Americans out west. So this is all Western stuff. So like Arizona, New Mexico, the Dakotas, Montana. This is Western. And today the Indian population would be rounded up and put on reservations in various states. So whether I'm in Oklahoma or I'm in Montana or Arizona or New Mexico, there are special places that the government reserved, right? That's where we get the word reservation, reserved for Native Americans so they can live their life and have their culture. But the United States still technically oversees them, and it's always been a source of tension. And it really was exploding into violence in the last part of the 1800s as they were finally conquered. So the Indian Wars were a big thing, obviously, for Native Americans and for the U.S. Army. It was something they had to deal with as the Native Americans continue to be pushed off their land. Also in the late 1800s, a war comes along with William McKinley. He's our president from Ohio. And this war is an interesting little war. It only lasts about 10 months, and I should say 10 weeks. It's not a very long war at all. The Spanish control a lot of the world. Remember, they were in a world power back in the 1600s, 1700s, and they still had a lot of territory. And they had Cuba, and the people of Cuba were rising up against Spain, and the United States was kind of caught in the middle. We didn't really want to get involved. We'd sent a ship called the Maine. There you can see the little logo, a little button, that went down to Cuba to just kind of watch American interest, if there were any Americans there. And suddenly there was an explosion on the ship, and Americans died. And that's all it took, really, to get the American press all fired up about this war with Spain, calling us to go to war. The president didn't really want to go, but the public pressure was intense because of what the people in the press wrote about it. And so the press really pushed this war on America. And it's not a long war at all. Spain is defeated pretty easily by the United States. Not only do we defeat Spain, but we get a lot of their territory, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. That's how Puerto Rico becomes part of the American system, American territory. Maybe the most famous part of the war, besides the Maine, the ship blowing up. And before we leave that, though, you'll notice as you study history more that we do have a pattern in American history that when one of our ships is blown up or destroyed, it will lead to war. Now, the Maine, there was idea that the Spanish did it, but it might have been just an accident on board. But either way, the newspapers ran with it. Same thing with World War I in the early 1900s. One of our ships will be attacked. And, of course, with Pearl Harbor at the beginning of World War II. But probably the most famous part of the war is this rise of this kind of rough and tough guy named Teddy Roosevelt, who'd been kind of a local politician, involved as like an assistant secretary of the Navy a little bit. And when the war started, he volunteered to be part of what would be these Rough Riders. These volunteers, because the military wasn't quite ready for the war, they had to call up and activate a lot of volunteers and get ready for this war with Spain. And Teddy Roosevelt is kind of a hero during the war. He'll lead a charge or be part of an attack in Cuba. And here you see an actual photograph of Teddy Roosevelt in the middle there with some of the Rough Riders, which were actually the first United States volunteer cavalry. Remember, cavalry are the people who ride horses. This is in 1898. Teddy Roosevelt will become a war hero during this particular small war with Spain and go on to be so popular that McKinley would pick him as vice president. He's the only president that we've had who, he later becomes president when McKinley dies, the only president we've ever had to win this Medal of Freedom that's given for valor during war. And of course today is iconic, right? He's part of Mount Rushmore and just right up there with probably the most popular of presidents. But it all started really with this war with Spain where he becomes a hero. McKinley picks him as vice president, and then of course McKinley is assassinated. Let's talk about another issue that was happening during the late 1800s, which would be The Democrats really had very little success as president, but they were able to find a winner with Grover Cleveland. And remember, Grover Cleveland is the 2 non-consecutive terms, so he was the 22nd and the 24th president. And a lot of the issues of the day was really about gold and silver. So think about this. Think about the fact that you could have, at one point, taken your dollar bill to the bank and gotten a dollar's worth of gold. So that means that our money was backed by gold. We call it the gold standard. Of course, today our money is not. It's just we trust our government, and the government is a good government. It's been around for a long time, and our money is worth something. But for a long time, the money was backed by actually literally having gold in banks. There were some people who wanted it also to be gold and silver. So there was a lot of debate in the late 1800s whether money should be backed with gold and silver. Problem was we didn't have a lot of gold at certain points. In fact, Grover Cleveland, as the president, had to borrow some gold from some of these rich people who were making lots of money, like, well, for example, J.P. Morgan, the banker. He lent the government a lot of gold because we didn't have a lot. When you don't have a lot to back up your money, it can lead to panics, led to a lot of problems. That meant that some people wanted us to have silver as well. So there was a lot of debate whether we would back our money with gold and silver or just gold. And it was one of the big issues. And of course, basically in 1900, we go with just gold. And then a little later on, like in the 1970s, we just totally do away with gold as backing our money. But it was a thing for a long time. Democrats struggled with this, trying to find voters that would support them. But Grover Cleveland was pretty popular. William Jennings Bryan is a Democrat who will run again and again and again, like 3 times. So he's a popular Democrat. He's never going to win, but he is kind of the face of the Democrats. He doesn't really like the gold standard. He wants it to be gold and silver. Silver helped us a lot of the poorer folks, but Democrats generally aren't going to be very successful on the national level. But on the local level, Democrats are running a lot of the big cities, and sometimes in a way that's corrupt. Now, there are Republicans as well, but some of the most famous, I would say, of this time period are political bosses. Those are people who run corrupt city machines. These city machines basically are politicians who work to give people jobs in exchange for people who vote for them. So it's kind of a give and take, but of course today we know this is illegal. But politics during that time period were very corrupt, especially, say, in New York City, what we might refer to as Tammany Hall. At Tammany Hall, they had political bosses who, if you voted for them, they would give you jobs, and this meant they would have power, you would have a job. It seemed like everybody would be happy. A lot of immigrants were eager to find a work and settle into America and life, so they would vote for people like Boss Nast, who you see on the slide here, or Plunkett on the left. These were just like local political leaders, but wielded a tremendous amount of power in cities like New York. So the way it went down, you voted for them, and they would give you a job, and they controlled a lot of the government contracts, especially in the city. So this is generally considered corruption. Graft is another word for corruption, and it was very popular during the Gilded Age in big cities like New York. And just a final thought on this assassination of these presidents. It really does shake a country when the president is shot. President Garfield is shot. Abraham Lincoln's the first to be killed, and that shocked the country. And then in 1880, when Garfield was elected, everyone expects him to serve his term, but shortly right after he's sworn in, he is shot in a train station in Washington, D.C. You can see that sketch there, kind of in the middle. Shot in the back by someone who doesn't believe in government, wants America to stop being America, and so McKinley will die after a few months of trying to recover, and he doesn't really recover at all. This is before we have any kind of real idea about germ theory and germs and infection and things. And the same thing with William McKinley in 1901. He is shot at a big kind of fair in Buffalo, New York, and would die a few weeks later, making Teddy Roosevelt the president.